The Arizona sun beat down on the dusty gravel like a hammer on steel, blinding and relentless. Heat shimmered across the open-air shooting range, making the air ripple like a mirage. I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I stepped up to the firing line, eyes filled with condescension, amusement, and a hint of smug superiority. They didn't try to hide it. After all, what could a woman like me possibly know about firearms? I was wearing faded jeans, an old tee with a coffee stain on the hem, and my hair was tied back in a loose bun that screamed, "No time for nonsense." I looked like someone's aunt who'd wandered in after a grocery run. Not like one of them, retired soldiers, hard-jawed survivalists, gun enthusiasts with tactical vests and boots polished like obsidian. One man chuckled loudly as he loaded his magazine behind me. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, lips curled in a smirk. "We'll tell you which way to point that thing." Laughter followed. It bounced off the steel targets like ricochets. My hands remained steady as I lifted the Glock I'd brought from home. It was older than some of the men chuckling behind me. I knew its weight, its balance, the rhythm of its recoil. I'd cleaned it 1,000 times, but none of that mattered here. They'd already judged me, already written my story in their minds. A simple woman trying to play dress-up in a man's world. They had no idea who I was. The timer beeped. My body moved on muscle memory. 2 shots center mass. 1 to the head. Slide lock. Reload. Shift stance. Pivot. Another target. Double tap. Smooth, precise, clean. The kind of shooting that didn't just come from practice. It came from necessity. My breathing was controlled, methodical. I didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. By the time I stepped away from the line, the laughter had stopped. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came when I rolled up my sleeve to wipe the sweat from my arm. The man in the navy ball cap, he'd been watching with narrowed eyes, suddenly went rigid. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to say something, but no words came. His gaze was locked on my upper arm, on the ink etched just below my shoulder. The tattoo wasn't flashy, not like the elaborate skulls or wings others wore. Just a symbol. Sharp lines, elegant curves. Meaningless to most, but not to him. Not to anyone who'd ever served in the teams. His silence spread like wildfire. The men around him turned, puzzled, then quieted one by one. Whatever performance I'd just given on the range was forgotten. Now all that mattered was the ink. That quiet, solemn symbol that didn't ask for respect, but demanded it anyway. He stepped forward slowly. His posture changed. No longer arrogant, no longer amused. The playful smirk was gone. In its place, a hard-set jaw and searching eyes. He pointed at the tattoo, voice hoarse like it had been choked by dust and memory. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I looked at him for the first time. Really looked. His stance. The subtle scar running just beneath his left ear. The calloused fingers twitching near his thigh like he expected an op to start any minute. This wasn't just any guy. He wasn't some weekend warrior playing at tough. He was a SEAL commander. I met his gaze without flinching. It was my husband's. A murmur swept through the crowd. And just like that, the heat, the noise, the stifling tension. It all melted away, leaving only silence and memory and something sacred that didn't need to be explained. I hadn't come to prove anything to these men. I didn't need to. I carried my story on my skin, in my hands, and deep in the quiet corners of my soul. And for the first time in hours, no one dared to speak. My name is Claire Dawson, and if you ask anyone in town about me, they'll probably shrug and say I'm just a simple woman. I run a small bookkeeping business from my home, volunteer at the local shelter, and I make a mean peach cobbler that wins blue ribbons at the county fair. I don't wear makeup most days, I garden with my bare hands, and I drive an old Ford that wheezes like it's got asthma. I never wanted to stand out. I never needed to. I was happy in the quiet corners of life, where days were measured in cups of coffee and the sound of birdsong. But before that life I was Claire Randall. Before I was a widow. Before I moved to this dusty corner of Arizona and tried to piece together a new life from the shards of my old one. My husband, James, served in the Navy SEALs for 12 years. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and brought calm with him, the kind of man whose silence spoke louder than most people's speeches. We met on a base in Norfolk, fell in love over MREs and midnight radio chatter, and married in a courthouse with no guests except 2 squad mates and a sleepy judge. He didn't tell me much about his missions, he couldn't. But I knew the weight he carried. I saw it in his eyes when he came home from deployments. I felt it in the long silences, in the way he'd sit with his back to the wall at diners, always scanning, always alert. He died 6 years ago. Not in combat. Not in some heroic blaze of glory. He was hit by a drunk driver while helping change a stranger's tire on the side of a highway. Some fates are crueler than bullets. Some stories end with broken glass and blood on asphalt instead of metals. After that, I faded. Grief does that, it drains the color out of everything. I moved out west not because I had family here or some grand plan, but because the house was affordable and far away from memories that hurt too much to keep looking at. I buried myself in routine. In small town life. It was safe. Predictable. But there's a funny thing about grief, it doesn't erase who you are underneath. It just buries it for a while. And sometimes, life has a way of digging it back up when you least expect it. The shooting range was James's thing. Not mine. But when a neighbor invited me to join a community skills class, I said yes without thinking. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just that I missed the sound of gunfire, the smell of powder, the rhythm of loading and firing, things I used to watch James do in the backyard range we had built together. I didn't expect anything when I showed up that day. Certainly not respect. Most of the people there were ex-military or die-hard tactical types who lived for this stuff. I was the odd one out. A woman in her 40s with no visible credentials and an old pistol that had seen better decades. I heard the whispers when I arrived. Probably thinks she's Lara Croft. Hope she knows which end the bullet comes out of. They had no idea who I was. And that's what made it matter. Because this wasn't just about proving myself. It was about defending James's memory. That tattoo on my arm wasn't a fashion statement. It was his SEAL team insignia, inked into my skin the week after his funeral, over the same spot where his fingers used to rest when he held me. I didn't need to tell anyone that. But I carried it everywhere, like a silent promise that I wouldn't let him be forgotten. So when I stepped up to that range, surrounded by people who had already decided I didn't belong, I wasn't just shooting at paper targets. I was standing up for something bigger. For the quiet strength of a man who never bragged about his service. For every woman who's been overlooked because she didn't fit someone's idea of what capable looks like. And for myself, because after years of hiding in the shadow of loss, it was time to remember who I really was. That's why this moment mattered. Not because they laughed at me, but because they didn't see me coming. It started small, almost imperceptible the way most dismissals do. I'd signed up for a basic marksmanship refresher course that met every Saturday morning at a local outdoor range just outside town. The instructor was a burly man named Mitch, retired Marine, loud voice, big belly, and an even bigger ego. He had a tendency to talk more than teach, always peppering his lessons with off-color jokes and war stories that grew taller every week. Most of the attendees were men, former military, retired cops, hunters. There were only 2 other women besides me and they kept mostly to themselves. The first class was all theory, handling, safety, stances. Mitch talked fast, barely paused to let anyone ask questions, and seemed more interested in swapping stories with his regulars than including the newcomers. I listened quietly, took notes, didn't raise my hand once. It wasn't worth the attention. But the second class? That's when it started. We were on the range doing live fire drills, and Mitch was walking down the line correcting posture. When he got to me, he stopped short and let out a laugh that turned a few heads. "Oh Lord," he said loud enough for the whole group to hear. "You holding that grip like you're about to water your garden, not shoot a Glock." A few chuckles rose from behind me. My spine stiffened, but I didn't say a word. I simply adjusted my grip, not because he told me to, but because I'd noticed the recoil was drifting left. Then he added, "Don't worry, darlin'. You'll get the hang of it. Probably just takes longer when you've spent your life balancing casseroles instead of carbines." That one hit like a slap. The way he said darlin' wasn't charming, it was dismissive, coated in that syrupy tone some men reserve for women they've already decided aren't worth taking seriously. More laughter followed. A few men nodded as if it were gospel. I should have said something. I should have spoken up. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I just took a breath, locked my jaw, and loaded my next magazine. By the 3rd week, the teasing had escalated from patronizing comments to thinly veiled ridicule. Mitch handed out paper targets, standard silhouettes, and when I took mine, I noticed someone had drawn a smiley face with lipstick and eyelashes on it. "Claire's twin," someone snickered. I didn't turn to see who said it. I didn't need to. Their laughter said enough. That's when the anger started to settle in, not the explosive kind, but the cold, simmering kind that builds with every sideways glance and whisper. I wasn't a stranger to that feeling. I'd felt it at James's funeral when some of the Navy wives whispered about how I wasn't military enough to understand what he went through. I'd felt it again when the insurance rep subtly implied I should have had him home sooner. And now here it was again, judgment disguised as banter. Condescension wrapped in camouflage. It wasn't just the mockery that stung, it was how quickly they'd written me off. Like I hadn't earned the right to be there. Like my presence was a punchline. But the part that cut deepest? I saw James in all of them. The way they stood. The way they talked. The way they threw around that rough, brotherly banter that he used to come home laughing about. He would have been one of them. Not the ones making fun, no, but he would have fit in just like they did. He would have been standing there with his arms crossed, quiet and unreadable, and I wondered, just for a split second, if even he might have doubted me in that moment. That thought scared me more than any of their jokes. Still I stayed. I kept showing up. Kept loading mags, adjusting my stance, improving my groupings. Quietly. Relentlessly. Letting the laughter roll off me like rain on metal. Until the morning the SEAL commander showed up. I didn't know who he was at first. None of us did. He wasn't part of the regular group. Just a guest instructor invited by Mitch to do a one-off session on tactical transitions and situational awareness. His name was Dane Colburn. Clean-shaven, lean muscle, quiet eyes that didn't miss a thing. He barely spoke during the warm-up drills, only nodding when Mitch introduced him. But the moment he watched me shoot, everything changed. Not right away, not on the first round or even the second. But when I moved through the combat drill like it was a choreographed dance I'd done 100 times before, when I reloaded without looking and double-tapped 2 targets in motion without flinching, his head tilted. Not out of surprise but recognition. Like he'd seen something he hadn't expected. Like he saw someone he'd once known. And when I rolled up my sleeve to wipe my arm and revealed James's insignia tattooed on my bicep, that's when he froze. You could have heard a pin drop. For a full 5 seconds after Dane Colburn saw my tattoo, the range fell silent, eerily so. The usual chatter, the casual boasts, even the trigger clicks from distant booths all seemed to pause. He stared at my arm not like it was just ink but like it was a memorial wall. His mouth opened slightly and then he closed it again, jaw tightening. I could see the recognition flood his face. That insignia meant something to him. It wasn't just a team logo, it was a bond, a legacy, a piece of history etched into the skin of the fallen and those they loved. Mitch noticed it too. His brow furrowed as he walked over, clearly sensing that something important had just happened but not quite understanding what. "What's that you're looking at, Commander?" he asked, trying to play it off with a grin. Dane didn't answer him. He looked at me instead. "SEAL Team 4, he said quietly, almost reverently. That was James Randall's team. I nodded once. He was my husband. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't tear up. I didn't offer some grand explanation. I just said the words plainly, the way I'd said them 100 times before when someone brought up James's name, each time feeling like I was peeling off a scab that never really healed. Dane exhaled slowly as if the memory of James had punched the air from his lungs. Then he took a single step back and, much to everyone's astonishment, he raised his hand in a sharp, silent salute. The gesture was crisp, full of respect, heavy with meaning. That's when the air around me shifted. I didn't need to look around to feel the discomfort ripple through the group. The men who had spent weeks mocking me, calling me darlin', and drawing faces on my targets, now they stared at me with an awkward mix of guilt and awe. Some glanced at their boots, suddenly finding the gravel more interesting than the woman they'd ridiculed. One guy in a camo vest muttered something and stepped away like he needed to be somewhere else. Mitch. He was the only one who tried to double down. "Well hell," he laughed, clapping me on the shoulder with a hand that felt too heavy, too fake. "Guess that makes you royalty round here, huh? SEAL wife and all." Dane's eyes snapped to him. "She doesn't need your validation, Sergeant," he said coldly. The use of Mitch's old rank was deliberate, sharp and dismissive. She earned her place here. More than most. The sting in his voice left no room for argument. Mitch's smile faltered for a moment, then returned, tighter this time. He stepped back with a casual shrug, but his eyes had lost their sparkle. The bravado that had driven his every joke, every jab, suddenly felt hollow. After that day everything changed. Not overnight. Not completely. But the energy at the range was different. Men who used to ignore me now nodded when I arrived. Some even offered to spot me. The whispers stopped. The smirks faded. The target drawings ceased entirely. But the silence that replaced them? It wasn't respect. Not really. It was guilt. They didn't know how to act around me anymore. Was I fragile? Was I dangerous? Was I silently judging them for their past behavior? They didn't know, and the not knowing left them awkward, uncertain. That awkwardness became a wall. Suddenly I was ma'am instead of darlinda. I was greeted with stiff, formal nods and kept at a polite distance. Where they'd once mocked me for being a nobody, now they treated me like I was untouchable. It wasn't inclusion. It was exile by reverence. And you know what? That might have been worse. Because I hadn't come to the range to be mourned. I hadn't come to wrap myself in James's shadow. I'd come to reconnect with the world, myself. I didn't need their pity or their overcompensation. I didn't need a memorial. I needed a challenge. I needed to belong. That Saturday after the drills were over, I packed up my gear slower than usual. Dane stayed behind too. I could feel his eyes on me as I cleaned my Glock. "You shoot like someone who's been trained," he said finally, stepping closer. I looked up. James taught me. He believed I should know how to handle myself. Just in case. Dane nodded. "He trained you well. Did you serve with him?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "Twice. Ramadi and Kandahar. He saved my life in Helmand. Never got to thank him." There it was again, that lump in my throat that came from pride and pain all tangled together. "You just did," I said softly. He looked at me for a long moment, then added, "If you ever want to teach a few of the rookies out here, say the word. They could use someone like you." It was a small gesture. But it meant the world. Because maybe I didn't need to prove myself anymore. But I could still make sure no one else like me ever had to. The next Saturday I arrived early. Earlier than usual. The desert wind was still soft, brushing against my cheek like a breath of calm before the heat settled in. I stood at the edge of the range, watching the sun crawl slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. It reminded me of mornings with James, those rare peaceful ones when he wasn't deployed, when we'd sip bitter coffee on the porch and talk about nothing just because we could. I missed that kind of silence. The easy kind. Not the kind I'd been living in lately, the heavy, polite, suffocating silence that followed me like a shadow since the day Dane recognized the tattoo. But I wasn't angry. No, I was ready. Something inside me had shifted after my conversation with Dane. For years I'd been moving through life like a ghost, avoiding attention, dodging confrontation, keeping my head down. I told myself I preferred it that way, simple, quiet, safe. But that day at the range reminded me, I wasn't built to fade. James hadn't loved me because I was quiet. He loved me because I was calm in the chaos, because I asked hard questions, because I could hold my ground even when it shook. And I was done letting other people define my presence. So I came with a plan. Not revenge, not exactly. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted was ownership. I wanted that range to feel like a place I belonged in, not because I wore James's memory like armor, but because I'd earned my space like anyone else. I didn't want to be respected because of him, I wanted to be respected as me. Which is why I'd brought the binder. A thick, weather-worn, spiral-bound training manual James had once used to teach rookies. It was filled with drills, diagrams, corrections, and tactical breakdowns. Some of it was old school, sure, but the fundamentals hadn't changed. And I'd spent the last week updating it, personalizing it, even color-coding sections so it was easier to navigate. It was exactly what the Saturday crowd needed. Something organized, something tactical, something that wasn't Mitch's half-drunken storytelling and vague range corrections. And this time I didn't wait for permission. When Mitch arrived, 20 minutes late as usual, scratching his belly and sipping a lukewarm energy drink, I stepped up before he could start barking orders. "Morning, Mitch," I said with just enough edge in my voice to get the group's attention. "Mind if I run the warm-up drills today?" He blinked at me. Twice. Like he couldn't quite compute what I'd said. Then he laughed. "You want to teach the warm-up?" "Well, I've been asked," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Commander Colburn suggested it. Said I had something to offer." That shut him up. Even the guys behind him straightened up a bit. I walked to the front of the line and held up the binder. This is a fundamentals refresher, adapted from a real-world SEAL training template. We're going to go through 5 controlled shooting drills today. Controlled grip, sight picture, controlled pairs, rhythm transitions, and a one-hand emergency reload. If you're too good for fundamentals, feel free to watch. But I guarantee even the best of you will get something out of this. No one moved. So I began. And to their credit, they followed. It was rocky at first. Some of them dragged their feet, others smirked. But by the second drill they were leaning in, asking questions, making adjustments. The sarcastic energy that had once dominated the range was gone, replaced by real focus. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were listening. Somewhere in the middle of the third drill, Mitch wandered to the sidelines and stayed there. He didn't say a word. Just watched, arms folded across his chest. Maybe he was waiting for me to screw up. Maybe he was just confused. Either way, I didn't care. By the end of the session, every man on that line had finished the drills with tighter groupings than usual. We reloaded in silence, shared glances of respect. Not awe, not pity, not reverence. Just respect. And that was all I wanted. After the last target dropped, one of the younger guys, a quiet kid named Trevor who'd barely spoken to me before, walked up and asked, "Ma'am, do you do private lessons?" I smiled. "Call me Claire." And yes, I do now. From behind I heard Mitch scoff. "Well, I'll be damned." I turned to him, binder still in hand. "You could use the drills too. If you're not too good for fundamentals." That got a few laughs. Not mocking ones, real ones. Shared ones. And just like that, the balance shifted. Not because I yelled. Not because I fought. But because I stepped forward with a plan and I proved, without screaming or demanding, that strength doesn't always come with noise or bravado. Sometimes it shows up quietly. Prepared. And absolutely unshakable. The next few weeks unfolded like the steady draw of a bowstring, tightening, refining, building power in the silence. After that first Saturday where I took charge, something shifted. Word traveled fast. The story of the widow who taught SEAL drills made its way across every circle that frequented the range. Suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't the lady with the old Glock. I was Claire, and they said my name like it belonged. More and more shooters started arriving early, lining up before Mitch even made it out of his pickup. Some brought notebooks. Others brought new questions. A few even brought their wives and daughters. They'd seen something that morning, a different kind of leadership. One that didn't come from barking orders or puffed chests, but from clarity, precision, and respect. It wasn't about commanding attention. It was about deserving it. And as for Mitch, oh, he tried to reclaim his spotlight. The very next weekend, he marched onto the range wearing a tactical vest he'd obviously dusted off from some forgotten era, his voice booming with false confidence. "All right, troops. I hope you enjoyed our guest instructor last time," he said with a pointed glance in my direction. "But today we're back to my program." No one moved. Someone, Trevor I think, coughed politely. "Actually, sir, Claire was going to finish the rhythm fire module from last week." Mitch's smile froze. Was she now? Dane Colburn appeared then like clockwork. He wasn't scheduled to teach that day, but he had a quiet way of showing up when needed. He gave Mitch a nod that felt more like a dismissal and turned to me. "Binders in your hand, Claire. You've got the line." I didn't gloat. I didn't grin. But I did nod and say, "Thank you, Commander." And then I ran the line. We dove deeper, clearing malfunctions under stress, using cover, transitioning between weapons. I even ran a blindfolded reload drill James had once made me do in our garage. It had seemed ridiculous back then. Now, they ate it up. By the end of that session, even Mitch couldn't pretend he hadn't learned something. I caught him watching quietly, adjusting his own stance during a single-handed drill. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. But the real payoff didn't come until 2 weeks later. That Saturday we were prepping for a timed course, a full tactical walkthrough with shoot/don't shoot scenarios. I'd set up the entire course myself with Dane's blessing. It wasn't just about speed or accuracy. It was about judgment, pressure, thinking on your feet. And when I handed out the printed plans for the day, Mitch, who hadn't said more than a few words to me in days, spoke up from the back. "Claire." I turned, surprised by the weight in his voice. There was no sarcasm. No forced cheer. "I was a weapons instructor in Quantico for 4 years, he said. Trained a lot of guys. Taught them the same drills you're running now." He paused like the next sentence tasted strange in his mouth. "But I never ran them better than you do." The whole line went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I gave you hell," he added, looking straight at me. "That was wrong. You've more than earned your place here." That moment? That was the real revenge. Not the drills. Not the binder. Not the SEAL's salute. Just a man who once mocked me now standing tall, stripped of pride and saying the words out loud. Apology by admission. Respect by action. Afterward the guys treated me like I was one of them. Not just tolerated. Not just admired from a distance. Included. Consulted. I helped a newlywed couple pick out matching sidearms. I was asked to co-lead a weekend survival shootout. I was even offered a part-time instructor slot by the range's board. But what truly sealed it all? A hand-delivered envelope. I found it one morning in my mailbox, thick cardstock, no return address. Inside was a patch, worn, frayed at the edges. The Team 4 insignia. James's old unit. And a note. Claire. You carry the flame better than most who've worn the uniform. Thank you for reminding us who we are. DC. I held that patch in my hand for a long time. No tears. No trembling. Just a quiet, overwhelming sense of peace. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or fight fire with fire. I'd simply stood firm. Stepped up. And showed them, all of them, that strength doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly. And rewrites the rules. Life didn't magically transform after that. There were still rough days, still moments where grief crept in like a shadow at sunset. But something fundamental had shifted, like I'd finally stepped back into my own skin after wearing someone else's for too long. That range became more than a practice ground. It became a kind of home. Not because it was warm or welcoming right away, but because I'd earned my place within its dust and gunpowder and sharp-edged personalities. Every drill I led, every new shooter I helped correct, every call I made to the board about safety protocols or training days, each one rewrote the story that others had once tried to impose on me. No longer the widow. No longer the joke. Just Claire. There was something poetic about it, in a way. I'd spent so long trying not to stand out that I'd forgotten what it meant to stand for something. In time, I wasn't just helping lead courses. I was mentoring women who had never touched a firearm before, coaching high schoolers in competition prep, and working with veterans trying to reacclimate to civilian life. We shared stories, sometimes in whispers behind hearing protection, sometimes with laughter between rounds. One Marine vet named Angela pulled me aside after class one day and said, "You give us a reason to come back out here. You remind us we're still worth something." I didn't cry. But I held her hand longer than I needed to. Even Mitch softened. He never became overly warm. Some men are carved from granite and just get smoother around the edges, but we found a rhythm. He started asking for my feedback on course structure, range protocols, even suggested we co-host a women's tactical workshop. I never expected a friendship with him. But respect was more than enough. Dane checked in every so often, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes with a younger SEAL recruit in tow who needed a reminder that the loudest person in the room isn't always the wisest. His presence became quieter with time, less about the symbolism of James and more about shared purpose. I think he knew I didn't want to be looked at through the lens of a fallen soldier's memory forever. Because I wasn't just the woman who had been married to a SEAL. I was the woman who remembered who she was because of what he taught her. And that tattoo. To stop being a shield. It became a signature. Not of who I'd lost, but what I carried forward. One quiet morning I stood by myself at the far end of the range. The sun was just peeking over the mountains, painting everything in pale gold. I took a slow breath, loaded a single magazine, and fired 3 deliberate shots into the steel target. Bing, bing, bing. No fanfare. No witnesses. Just me, the wind, and a feeling of peace I hadn't felt in years. I walked down to check the target, my boots crunching softly in the gravel. Dead center all 3. That's when I realized, I didn't come here to prove anything. I came to remember. And in remembering, I reclaimed something far more powerful than anyone's approval. I found my voice. I found my footing. I found myself. By Wednesday, I received 2 separate emails from board members, both apologizing and claiming they had no idea Karen had been targeting me directly. One even admitted they were misled about the property boundaries, and appreciated the clarification. I wasn't naive enough to believe all of them were suddenly on my side, but I knew at least a few were realizing Karen had overstepped. On Friday, the real moment of reckoning arrived. I was working on my porch when I saw Karen's silver BMW creeping down the road. She didn't park in her driveway. No, she stopped right in front of my cabin, stepped out in a pristine tennis outfit, and stood at the edge of my property like a marble statue cracking under pressure. I stood silent, waiting. She finally spoke. "So that's how you want to handle this?" I shrugged. "That's how I had to handle it." Her eyes narrowed. "You blindsided the board." I held up the binder. "You trespassed." "What?" Harassed. "This is me protecting what's mine." She hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a barely audible snort, she turned on her heel and walked away. No apology. No admission. Just retreat. But I didn't need her to say it. I'd won, not with threats or shouting but with quiet precision. I had used her weapon, paperwork, and turned it into a sword. And the best part? I wasn't done yet. The next week was the most peaceful I'd had all summer, almost eerily so. No letters, no foot traffic, no surprise inspections or joggers lingering at the edge of my dock pretending to check their pulse. Karen's house sat unusually quiet, her curtains drawn more often than not, her outdoor lights dimmed. It was as if she'd retreated into her fortress, licking her wounds. But I wasn't fooled. People like Karen didn't give up that easily. They just regrouped. So I moved first. Using my lawyer's advice, I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's department regarding the repeated trespassing incidents. I submitted time-stamped footage, witness statements, and digital records from my surveillance system that clearly showed Karen's guests crossing into my private property, sometimes directly after speaking to her. I wasn't looking to get anyone arrested, but I wanted a record. Something official. Something undeniable. The deputy who reviewed it actually whistled and said, "You've got more evidence than we usually get for break-ins." Then, just for good measure, I contacted the county zoning office and asked for a public review of HOA boundaries and recent complaints filed against non-HOA parcels. That triggered an audit, one that revealed Karen had filed no fewer than 13 nuisance complaints in the past 90 days. Most of them against me, and none of them valid. That was strike one. Strike two came when I uploaded a redacted version of my security footage to a private Facebook group for our lake community. No names, no faces, just the clear image of strangers drinking on my dock, then climbing into my boat and paddling away. The caption was simple. Reminder, please respect private property around the lake. This cabin is not part of the HOA and has its own deeded boundaries. Let's all enjoy the summer, respectfully. The post exploded. Dozens of comments flooded in. People I hadn't heard from in months chimed in with their own stories, small things mostly. Petty fines. Threats over paint colors. One neighbor admitted Karen had chastised his elderly mother for hanging her laundry too visibly on the porch. Another confessed she had stopped attending community events because Karen had called her out for not bringing a dish to a potluck. Slowly, a picture emerged, not just of an overbearing neighbor, but of someone who'd made herself feared. Strike three arrived a few days later at the next HOA meeting. Normally I'd never attend. But this time I walked in carrying my binder and a USB drive. I wasn't on the agenda, but several board members had seen the footage and invited me anyway, quietly off the record. The moment I entered, a hush fell over the room. Karen sat near the head of the table, posture perfect, expression tight. I waited until the open forum section, then calmly stood and introduced myself. "I'm not a member of the HOA, I began, "and legally I never will be. But I live here. And I think the time has come to clarify a few things." I handed out printed packets to everyone at the table. Deed copies, survey maps, violation notices with Karen's handwriting highlighted, and county records confirming the protective covenant. Then I plugged in my USB and played a short, silent clip. The trespassing, the dock parties, the inspection volunteer walking onto my land. No narration. No music. Just the facts. By the end, a few board members looked visibly uncomfortable. One leaned back and said, "This really isn't okay." Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "He's twisting this. He's painting me like some kind of..." I turned to her. "You don't need me to paint you as anything. You did that yourself." Silence. No one rushed to her defense. No one even looked her in the eye. The president of the board, an older woman named Carol who'd kept quiet for most of the meeting, finally cleared her throat and said, "I think it's time we reassess how enforcement is being handled, especially on properties outside our jurisdiction." Karen's jaw twitched. Her control was slipping and she knew it. The following day, I received an email from the HOA board stating that all prior communications sent in error to my address would be formally rescinded. They apologized for any confusion and said my property was officially recognized as exempt from HOA oversight. A copy of the letter was sent to the county. I printed it and framed it. As for Karen, her influence waned overnight. She wasn't removed from the board, not right away, but her grip loosened. Fewer emails. Fewer citations. Neighbors started waving at me again. A few even stopped by to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw a party. I just sat on my dock one golden evening with a cooler, a fishing rod, and the sound of cicadas humming in the trees. That dock was mine. That land was mine. And now everyone knew it. Summer wound down slowly after that, the lake settling into a familiar rhythm. Mornings brought mist and birdsong. Evenings were painted in orange and indigo, the water still as glass. The chaos, the tension, it all seemed like a strange fever dream now. But the memory of it clung to the property like heat in the boards of the dock. My sanctuary had been threatened, and though the worst was over, I hadn't forgotten what it felt like to have something precious trampled by someone who thought she had the right. Karen surprisingly didn't leave. I half expected a for sale sign to pop up on her perfectly manicured lawn after the fallout from the meeting. But she stayed quietly. The party invites stopped. The social events she used to organize with carefully curated guest lists and passive-aggressive centerpieces were canceled due to low attendance. She no longer patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard. Her dog still barked every morning, but now from behind her closed gate. I'd see her sometimes standing on her porch with a mug in hand, watching the lake like she was waiting for something. Maybe for me to crack. Maybe for the board to change their minds. Or maybe just for the power she'd lost to come crawling back. But it didn't.